Norfield, Ohio was the kind of place that never made the papers, not because nothing ever happened, but because everything that did was absorbed quietly, like rain sinking into dry earth. It was 1841, and most of the town still ran on horse carts, prayer, and the sturdy illusion that good people birthed more good people. And in Norfield, no family was held in higher regard than the Baldwins. The father, Emery Baldwin, was a schoolteacher with calm hands and perfect posture, a man who always smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Clorinda Baldwin, his wife, was the town's unofficial midwife and keeper of herbal knowledge passed down through God-fearing women. Together, they had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, who never yelled, never cried, and never fought. Their shoes were polished even when they played in the orchard, their cheeks pink with quiet health. They were, as many would say in passing, untouched by hardship. But if you asked too many questions, people's eyes would shift. They'd say, they've just been blessed, or that family walks with the Lord, and quickly find somewhere else to be. Norfield had its drunks, its drifters, and its tragedies. Barns burned down, infants died in fever, and more than one man never returned from a walk into the woods. But not the Baldwins. Their house never needed repairs. Their children never limped or bruised. There were no tears at their table, no broken bones, no doctors called in the dead of night. And in a town stitched together by whispered wounds and Sunday sermons, the absence of suffering didn't feel like peace. It felt like something was missing. There were no funeral processions at the Baldwin property, even when the children stopped appearing one by one. First Joseph, aged 10, said to have been sent to stay with distant cousins in Dayton. Then Margaret, the only daughter, vanished from the school registry with a simple note. Educating at home now. A year later, young Elias fell from a tree, or so it was said, and no further questions were allowed. No grave, no marker, just silence. By the time the third boy, Matthew, stopped attending church, the town no longer asked. If you asked Emery, he would nod solemnly and say the children were fine. The Lord sees our grief and gives us silence in return, he once said to a neighbor. But no one remembered hearing him weep. Clorinda still baked bread every Sunday. She still kept her garden perfectly weeded, and no Baldwin ever looked tired. They were not secretive, only oddly still. Their house, a 2-story timber frame with soft blue shutters, was always pristine, windows polished, chimneys clean. A white curtain swayed gently in every room as if beckoning breeze into air that never seemed stale. The only strange thing, if you were paying attention, was how often Emery walked the perimeter of his own land, always at the same hour, always with a little leather book he never let go. There was something unmarked about the town itself, too. Stray dogs avoided Norfield's western edge. Birds nested elsewhere. Children said that the orchard behind the Baldwin house had trees that made no sound in wind. Some swore that when you stood near the Baldwin fence you could hear humming, not from any person, but from the soil. The local priest once described the family as blessed with a sacred quiet, but later recanted it privately, confessing to another clergyman that the Baldwin eyes, all of them, looked too long at the altar as though memorizing it. The children, before they disappeared, were said to have a habit of watching others blink. One teacher recalled Margaret sitting perfectly still during a thunderstorm, never flinching once. As years passed, newcomers asked about the Baldwin children. Were they married, off to school? The answers changed. One was a teacher in Toledo, another a tradesman, one gone east for health reasons. But no one had letters. No one ever visited. Their names appeared on no records after Norfield, and somehow that was enough. There was no proof of tragedy, no screams, no stains, just well-swept porches and a quiet that wrapped the Baldwin land like gauze. Norfield had its stories, small ones forgotten fast. But the Baldwin name was never part of gossip, not because they were feared, not because they were loved, but because there was something in that silence that warned, do not disturb what makes no sound. And so the town didn't. Not until the cellar was found, not until the hymnal surfaced, not until someone opened the floorboards. But that comes later. For now all anyone could say was that Norfield, Ohio was a town with no scars, because the ones that should have been there had never been allowed to bleed. The first to vanish was Joseph, the eldest, a boy of 10 with cold dark hair and soft-spoken habits, always seen holding the door open for others, always trailing behind his father with obedient steps. One day he was simply gone. The teacher was told Joseph had taken ill and was recovering in a better climate, somewhere down south. Clorinda delivered the message herself with such composure that no one thought to question it. She handed over a small bouquet of dried lavender to the schoolmaster and asked that his name be removed from the attendance roll. Her voice never trembled. No formal notice was posted, no black ribbon tied to the gate. The Baldwin home remained quiet, clean, normal. In Norfield that was enough. No one pressed, no one searched. The ground, after all, gave no sign it had been disturbed. 1 year later, Margaret, their only daughter, disappeared just as quietly. She had been seen the week before, sweeping the porch in a gray dress with her braids tucked behind her ears. She had not cried when a neighborhood boy pushed her into the dust weeks earlier. She had not spoken at all, only stared back at him until he ran. Her mother once said Margaret was sensitive to sound and discouraged too much conversation. When the school teacher asked where she had gone, Emery replied she would be schooled at home now, as the world outside had become too loud for her. That was all. Again, no crying, no mourning, no coffin. The church bells did not ring. Then came Elias, the youngest at 6, who vanished after a supposed fall from a tree. The story came secondhand through a farmhand who'd once helped mend a fence on the Baldwin property. He claimed Emery mentioned it offhandedly while collecting apples in a basket, saying the boy had ascended early. The phrase didn't sit right with anyone who heard it, but by then the town had developed an unspoken rule. Do not question the Baldwins, not because of fear, but because asking led nowhere. You'd find no graves, no doctor's note, no grieving faces, just that same calm veneer as if nothing inside them had broken. What no one talked about, not openly, was how unnatural the house had started to feel. It wasn't just the missing children. It was how Clorinda still baked enough bread for 4, how she still set places at the table that no one used, how the upstairs curtains were always drawn shut, even in summer heat. Some of the older women in town claimed they had heard lullabies being sung after midnight, faint, uneven melodies with strange pauses like someone singing to someone who couldn't respond. One woman, Mrs. Cho Finley, confessed to her husband that she saw a child's silhouette pressed against the attic window just days after Elias was said to be gone. But when he went to look, the window was empty, spotless, and quiet. And yet none of this drew the town's attention in any official way, because the Baldwins were, by all outward appearances, good people. They donated quietly to the church. They hosted scripture readings. Emery still taught handwriting to poor children on Sundays. Clorinda offered remedies for coughs and headaches. Their house was always immaculate. There were no screams, no foul smells, no broken glass. It was as if the children had never existed at all, except for the empty chairs they left behind. And the way Clorinda sometimes stared at those chairs while stirring soup. Not crying, not frowning, just staring. Years later, when records were re-examined, it was discovered that no Baldwin child had ever been buried. Not in Norfield, not in any of the surrounding counties. There were no death certificates filed, No confirmation of travel. Only polite handwritten notes in school logs and a quiet understanding between townspeople that grief in the Baldwin house was private and pure. That maybe the children had left this world the way they had lived, with neat hair and folded hands and a silence no one dared interrupt. But beneath that calm, something darker had already taken root. A pattern had begun. The kind of pattern that only becomes visible when it's too late to stop it. The kind of silence that feeds on the absence of noise and learns to grow louder in the quiet. Horace Greer was not a man who left behind many records. He kept no family Bible, no marriage certificate, no children. His name appeared only once in the Norfield town ledger, scrawled in narrow ink beside the word lodging. He was a traveling embalmer, moving from town to town, offering preservation to those who could afford not just a coffin, but a body that wouldn't rot before its wake. He arrived in Norfield during a particularly dry spring, when the river had receded and the ground had hardened. No one remembered why he came. No one remembered who hired him. But Horace remembered. He would speak of it only once, decades later, as his breath began to fail and his hands shook too much to hold a spoon. He would say he was invited, not summoned, by a quiet note handed to him at a market 3 towns away. The note was unsigned, the handwriting meticulous. It gave him a date, a time, and an address. The Baldwin farm, just outside Norfield. He arrived just before dusk. Horace expected to find a family in mourning. Instead, he found Emery Baldwin alone in the barn, dressed in a dark coat, sleeves rolled to the elbows. No crying wife. No body laid out on a table, just the man, the tools, and a calmness that did not match the trade. Emery greeted him kindly, thanked him for coming, and handed over a leather pouch filled with coin, more than Horace usually received for full burial preparation. He was told there would be no embalming performed that night. Instead, Emery wanted instruction. Specifically, he asked to learn clean separation techniques, how to open a body without leaving bruises, how to drain fluids without external cuts, how to remove organs in a way that left the skin intact, untouched. Horace asked no questions, not because he didn't want to know, but because the coin was real and the barn was silent, and the man's face held no threat, just patience, just curiosity. Emery watched every move with interest. He asked intelligent questions. He took notes. He did not flinch when the practice material, a dead calf Horace had brought in preparation, was opened, its tongue removed through the throat, its rib cage lifted clean in a single gesture. Emery asked to repeat the steps. He did so with steady hands. Horace didn't realize he was teaching something else entirely. There was something off about the barn, though he couldn't name it. The air was too clean, the tools too organized. Jars lined the walls, filled not with grain or oil, but with preserved animal organs, small hearts, tongues, glistening loops of something indistinct. There were no labels, only numbers written on the glass, the kind of labeling used not for storage, but for study. Horace noted that there were no insects, even though the barn's wide doors remained open. No flies, no rats, as though something inside the walls repelled decay, or consumed it before it could begin. The only personal item in the entire space was a chair, too small for an adult, set neatly in the corner facing away. When asked about it, Emery simply said she liked to listen from there. He never said who. The lesson lasted 4 hours. When it was done, Emery offered Horace a warm meal and asked him to leave before sunrise, not in anger, not with menace, just insistence. Horace obeyed. He left Norfield the next day and never returned. But something stayed with him, a detail he couldn't shake. Not from that night, but from the following year, when he was traveling through another town and stopped to rest at a chapel. There he opened his guest book to note the names of clients served. On the last page, written in the same exact hand as the Baldwin note, was a message. "The voice is preserved in silence, thank you." There was no signature, but underneath the message was a single perfect thumbprint, some small as if from a child. Horace never told the law he never returned to Norfield. He believed, or perhaps chose to believe, that what he taught that night had no human application, that it had been curiosity, nothing more. But in his final years, as his lungs collapsed and the past refused to stay buried, he admitted one last thing. He had seen no body in the Baldwin barn, but the drain pipes had been cleaned already. The table had fresh linen, and on a nearby shelf among the tools was a book bound in something that was not leather. Something too soft, something that didn't belong in a barn. The discovery came by accident, though some would later say nothing that happened on Baldwin land was ever truly unplanned. It was the dry season again, and a boy named Tom Rudd had wandered into the edge of the Baldwin orchard looking for firewood. He wasn't supposed to be there. No one was. Most folks in Norfield said the trees didn't grow right out there, the bark too smooth, the fruit too firm, the air too still. Tom stumbled over a half-buried hinge in the ground, worn iron protruding just slightly from a patch of moss. Curious, he dug until his fingers struck a wooden frame, then screamed loud enough to bring 3 adults running. What they uncovered was not a storm shelter, not a tool cellar, and not the bones of a long-dead animal. What they found was a door, thick, sunken, and sealed in wax. Once broken open, the breath of 100 years seemed to exhale from beneath it, warm and odorless, like stepping into memory. The steps below led to a chamber dug by hand, impossibly smooth, lined in black stone and pressed clay. There were no spiders, no signs of decay. The air was dry, controlled, held in like a held breath. The room was quiet, but it wasn't empty. On the far end, under dim light trickling through small slits in the earth above, lay rows of human remains, preserved in a way no one could explain. Not wrapped, not buried, not stored like corpses, but displayed like still thoughts. Each body was laid out carefully on black cloth, folded without wrinkle. Their skin was pale but not sunken. Their faces expressionless, almost peaceful. But their mouths were stitched shut with pale linen thread, a method so precise it left no scarring, just a cross of silence over the lips. Their eyes had been painted open with a yellow-brown paste later identified as tree resin, applied in careful rings to hold the lids wide as if locked in eternal awareness. There were no labels, no gravestones, no names, but someone had taken their time. Fingernails were cleaned, hair brushed back, clothes tailored. The bodies had not been embalmed in the traditional sense. No formaldehyde, no draining, no scent of chemicals. Instead, their bodies had been dried from within, possibly with herbs, ash, and salts. One expert years later would suggest heat stones and mercury vapor. Another would suggest something darker. A process designed not to stop decomposition, but to remove the soul's ability to return. Because these weren't just corpses, they were statements. Each body perfectly posed, hands folded or at the sides, all oriented in the same direction, heads to the west. And all of them children. Among the remains was a tiny book placed on the chest of the smallest body. It had no title. The pages were hand-pressed, brittle, and stitched with thread too fine to be common. Inside were diagrams, anatomical sketches of mouths, throats, vocal cords. Detailed notes on silence as a sacred preservation of divine will. One page described a process called stilling, in which the vocal system was painted with resin to bind sound. Another page claimed that the moment of death was the most volatile point for a soul, and that if the mouth was closed and the eyes held open at that exact moment, The memory could be kept like a plant pressed in wax paper. A memory not of life, but of control, of permanence. No one in Norfield spoke publicly about the cellar. The Baldwin property was seized, of course. Investigators came and went, some leaving with shaking hands, others never filing their reports at all. A local preacher fainted upon seeing the room and would later admit that he had seen similar techniques used in so-called binding rituals during his missionary travels overseas, though none this clean, none this emotionless. The Baldwin family by then had vanished. The house stood empty. Clorinda and Emery were nowhere to be found. Only the orchard remained, untouched, unmoving, a place where no birds returned. And so the cellar was sealed again, boarded and buried under state order. Official records listed it as a historical anomaly. The bodies, all 11 of them, were sent to a university for study. But years later, when a new team tried to locate them, they found that the remains had been misplaced. All that remained were the cloths, black, folded, untouched by mold, and the book, still on its original page, still open to the passage that read, "To hold a thought forever, make it quiet, make it still, make it yours." The autopsy tables were cold and clinical, lit with gaslight and framed by silence that felt heavier than the air in the room. The preserved bodies from the Baldwin cellar had been transported to Cincinnati under official escort, locked in black crates and covered in linen. Scientists, pathologists, and linguistic specialists gathered in stunned disbelief as the first child was unwrapped. The preservation remained flawless. No sign of natural decomposition, no trauma to the flesh. But it was when the gloves came off, when the fingernails were lifted and the mouths pried open, that the true horror emerged. Etched beneath the fingernails in perfect miniature lines were words, not scratched but tattooed, black ink applied so precisely that the letters could only be seen under magnification. Beneath each nail, a phrase, a number, a symbol. The script shifted between Latin, Hebrew, and something no one could trace, a cipher built from unfamiliar shapes that didn't follow linguistic rules. Some messages were full phrases, prayers twisted into instructions. Others were single words repeated again and again: stillness, offering, witness. But one phrase was found in every child. Beneath the left thumbnail, each time the same 3 words: "The voice awaits." The dental team made the second discovery. On the inside of each cheek, tattooed into the gum line, were black rings. Concentric circles marked with intersecting lines like diagrams used in engineering or astronomy. Inside the mouths, tucked behind the molars or on the soft palate, were more messages inked into the flesh itself. One boy had a map of the human larynx drawn across the roof of his mouth. Another child's gums bore a sentence in Hebrew that translated roughly to, "The tongue is the door. Keep it closed." These were not the marks of someone insane. They were the work of a methodical, educated hand, someone who understood anatomy, language, and the silence of systems. Dr. Halverson, a linguist brought from Philadelphia, believed the ciphered phrases were musical notations encoded through visual rhythm. Others theorized they were spells, incantations, or instructions meant for someone who could understand a different kind of logic. Not verbal, but sensory. A code not meant to be read, but absorbed. As if the tattoos were meant to speak to something deeper than the mind. The leading theory became darker with each body examined. These children were being turned into vessels, not buried, not destroyed, but prepared, like sacred books, like offerings meant to be read by something that didn't need eyes. The ink itself was tested. It contained traditional carbon black, but also traces of iron ash and something else. Something organic. Skin, A unique peptide signature suggested the ink was made not just from soot or plant dye, but from rendered human tissue. Possibly bone dust, possibly brain matter. The realization broke one of the medical assistants. She left the building and never returned. The handwriting matched across every mark. One hand, one author. Emery Baldwin. The deeper question no one could answer was why. These weren't random atrocities. They were acts of message control, of theological obsession. A way to prepare the dead not for remembrance but for preservation of something unspeakable. Not memory, not grief, but silence itself. An engineered silence marked and maintained. One that couldn't be broken. One that didn't need sound to speak. The repetition of the voice awaits became a ritual echo, present not only on skin but in the margins of the Baldwin family Bible found locked in a floorboard weeks later. Written in invisible ink, only revealed under heat, the same phrase looped again and again, circling each psalm until scripture blurred into warning. No motive was ever discovered in the traditional sense. There were no letters of madness, no diaries of guilt. Only this repeated idea, that speech was contamination, that to speak was to decay, and that the purest state was the moment just before sound. The children had not been silenced in punishment. They had been transformed. From lives into containers, their flesh marked like sacred pages, folded and filed beneath the orchard in perfect alignment. And through it all, the question lingered like a cold breath down the spine. If the voice truly awaits, what was it waiting for? And had it already heard what it needed? Dr. Elias Merchant was known throughout Cincinnati not just for his steady hands, but for his silence. He worked alone, rarely spoke during procedures, and kept a strict log of every incision he ever made. He was methodical, unemotional, precise, a man who believed the body was a system of levers and vessels, not a place for mystery. When he was summoned to examine the Baldwin remains, he expected gruesome mistakes or ritualistic nonsense, something irrational done by someone broken. What he found instead shook his faith in every rule he believed kept order in the world. The children weren't simply killed, they were processed, treated like instruments of a specific design. They had been opened with such precision that no blood had pooled, no bruises formed, no tissue collapsed. Organs had been removed and returned to their cavities as if arranged for a demonstration. But the true discovery, the part that made Elias pause, was in the throat. Every single victim had a hardened larynx, its cartilage stiffened unnaturally, not with time but with chemical force. He tested the samples 3 times before he accepted the result. Mercury nitrate, applied directly to the vocal folds, a solution used in early photography to burn light into metal. But here, it had burned silence into flesh. Elias had never seen anything like it. The cords were brittle yet intact, each one frozen in a slightly different position, mid-vibration, as if their last breath had been captured like a phonograph needle in wax. He dissected them carefully, noting black specks around the vocal folds. Ink. Not spilled, applied, written. Under the microscope, tiny characters emerged, circling the tissue like a spiral seal. They weren't random. They followed the same cipher pattern already found in the gums and fingernails. But this wasn't a message. It was reinforcement, a sealing ritual, and not of wax or thread, but of language. Elias began to understand that whoever did this wasn't trying to silence the dead. They were trying to preserve the act of silence itself, like you might bottle scent or catch lightning in glass. In one child's throat, he found small fragments of gold leaf pressed between the trachea and the vocal folds. Too small to see without slicing deep, each piece no larger than a tooth flake. They had been cut into shape deliberately, not swallowed, not accidental. As he moved deeper into the chest cavity, he found another pattern. The lungs had been flushed with a saline solution mixed with resin and crushed mint, removing any sign of decomposition or bacterial life. The lungs were not breathing organs anymore. They were storage vessels, empty, dry, silent. The diaphragm had been sutured tight to prevent collapse, the chest sealed with melted wax from within. The body was no longer a person. It had been turned into a mechanism, a vault. Elias stepped back from the table and reviewed his notes. No traditional motive made sense. This wasn't punishment, it wasn't chaos, it was a structured desecration designed not to destroy but to protect, as if the killer feared what sound could do, or what it might invite. The use of mercury nitrate told him something else too. It wasn't just a chemical of preservation, it was dangerous, volatile. Prolonged exposure caused tremors, hallucinations, a breakdown of rational thought, but it also heightened precision in the short term. Elias suspected the killer had been exposed for years. Not poisoned accidentally, but intentionally, like a scientist willing to suffer madness for the sake of a clean result. One final detail stood out. Every body's hyoid bone, the small U-shaped bone that holds the tongue in place, had been removed. Carefully, with such surgical detail that no nerve endings were frayed. The hyoid is delicate, almost impossible to remove intact. But someone had taken the time, every time, as if they believed the tongue could never be fully stilled unless its anchor was gone. When Elias looked again at the open throats and the hollow mouths stitched tight, he didn't see murder. He saw ritual. He saw obsession. And then he noticed the back of his own surgical journal. On a page he didn't remember writing in, under the heading Findings, there was a note in someone else's hand. Small, inked in the margin like a whisper. The voice decays the memory, but silence keeps it whole. There was no signature, just a faint circle drawn around the sentence. One he now recognized, a cipher seal, still wet, as if it had been written while he worked. Elias closed the journal and didn't return to Norfield. But he never slept in silence again, because now he understood. The killer wasn't silencing children. He was studying how long silence could live inside a body, untouched, undisturbed, until someone tried to listen again. The Baldwin house had stood empty for nearly a decade before the county declared it safe enough for reclamation. It was weathered but untouched by time in the ways that mattered. No broken windows, no graffiti, no wildlife nesting in the rafters. The structure had simply waited like a room holding its breath. When a state-appointed crew arrived to begin the renovation, no one was prepared for what they'd find buried in its walls. On the second day, a worker removing old brickwork from the kitchen chimney flue struck something soft that shouldn't have been there. The bricks gave with unnatural ease, crumbling not from time, but from careful tampering. And behind them, wedged vertically in a crawl space between the inner flue and the wall, was a body. Or what remained of one. It was a child, female, judging by the size and remnants of a dress that had long since stiffened with time. She had been folded into the space with precision, knees to chest, arms crossed. There were no signs of panic in her posture, no signs of a struggle. But her skull had been split open from the crown, not with force but with technique. A perfect, deliberate seam ran from front to back as though opened like a jar. The top of the cranium had been removed cleanly and placed upside down on her chest like a lid. The brain was gone. In its place was something else. Arranged inside the hollow cavity were pressed flowers, dried and brittle but still recognizable. Lavender, rue, bloodroot. Nestled among them were teeth, dozens of them. Not just her own, there were too many for that. They had been polished, sorted by size, arranged in a spiral that twisted inward toward where the brain would have been. A message, maybe, or an offering. The forensic team handled the discovery with care, but nothing about the arrangement was careless. This was not concealment, it was placement. The girl had been made into a vessel like the others, but this one was different. She hadn't been preserved for display. She had been hidden, stored away in a place designed to draw smoke upward and out, a place of breath. Investigators theorized she may have been the first, the prototype, the beginning of whatever the Baldwin family had believed they were building. Her death predated the others by years, according to bone density and remnants of textile fibers. This was not just another victim. She had been special. Someone the killer didn't want the world to see. Not yet. Further study revealed that each flower inside her skull had a historic symbolic meaning: silence, protection, forgetfulness. Bloodroot in particular was once used in early medicine to numb the mouth and throat. It had also been used in death rites by several cultures to paint faces and seal lips. Mixed with the teeth, markers of voice, identity, childhood. The contents of her skull read like a ritual vocabulary, a language not spoken but placed. The skull itself had faint etchings along the inside wall, nearly invisible without scraping away the residue. Under magnification, they revealed the same cipher seen in previous findings, spiraling along the bone like a locked prayer. This time, though, the cipher ended not with "the voice awaits," but something else. A phrase no one could yet place. Translated crudely, it read, "The mouth was a door." It was unclear if the girl was Clorinda and Emery's own child, or someone taken long before their known children disappeared. There were no birth records to confirm her existence, no photograph, no name. But her bones told a story that others had not. Her ribs had been broken and reset multiple times during life. A fracture to the collarbone had healed improperly. Several missing teeth showed signs of removal while she was still alive. This wasn't just a vessel. This was practice, a rehearsal in shaping flesh to purpose. Before the method was perfected, before the ritual was quiet enough, the discovery inside the chimney rewrote the timeline. It proved that the silence didn't begin with the Baldwin children. It began earlier. And whoever she was, she had been the first to be emptied, not for beauty, not for display, but for study. And in the center of her hollowed skull, in the soil that had gathered where her brain had once been, was a final fragment of parchment curled with moisture. On it, the familiar seal, the cipher circle, and inside the ring, a single word: ready. The Baldwin name did not fade quickly from Norfield's church records. Though the family had long since vanished, their presence lingered in the margins of ledgers and in the fragile rituals that tied a town to its own memory. In the back of the choir's archive room, buried under old baptismal rolls and torn communion schedules, was a hymnal too beautiful to throw away and too strange to use. Its cover was made of pressed oak bark, smoothed and stained until it resembled dark leather with iron corners etched in symbols no one in the choir could read. It had no title. Only a small clasp held it shut, locked with a mechanism so finely made it seemed more like a pocket watch than a book latch. For years it sat untouched, mistaken as decoration or forgotten donation. But the key, simple brass, aged unevenly, was found hidden in the lining of the piano bench during a church cleaning. When inserted into the clasp, the book opened like a mouth that had been held closed for far too long. Inside, the pages were not paper. They were some form of treated hide, thin and off-white, veined with the faint outlines of pores and scars. Someone had stitched them into the spine by hand, each seam threaded with black string pulled so tightly it hummed when plucked. The ink was brown at first glance, but under light it revealed pale flecks of calcium, and a chemical analysis later confirmed what the eye already feared. It was bone ink, pulverized from human remains mixed with a protein binder and used like watercolor to etch music that was never meant to be sung. The sheet music bore notes that climbed and dropped in unnatural sequences, measures that extended too long or stopped too short, harmonies that didn't resolve but instead bent back on themselves like a circle with no center. But it was the dates, tiny, written beside certain bars of music that tore open the stomachs of those who read them. Every measure marked with these annotations matched a known disappearance in Norfield. The Baldwin children, the cellar victims, the girl in the chimney. Each vanished soul was paired with a measure of music. Not an elegy, not a eulogy, a pattern. Some lines ended abruptly, others repeated the same dissonant chord over and over, as if something needed to be reinforced, pressed into place. These weren't melodies for voices, they were blueprints, and when one of the notes was played on the church's aging piano, out of curiosity, out of fear, the sound it produced was not wrong exactly, but it didn't feel like something meant for human ears. It felt like a summons. Clorinda Baldwin's handwriting was found on the back inner cover. Not a signature, but a sentence. Let this be sung without tongue, that it may be heard without harm. Below that, the same circular seal drawn not in ink, but pressed into the material with what looked like a hot brand. The cipher again. Always the cipher. But this time it enclosed not a word, but a single symbol, a broken quarter note drawn backward. The implication was clear. The music had a function, but not for performance. It was not for ceremony. It was for control. Further study showed that the structure of the music resembled more than just failed harmony. It mirrored linguistic patterns found in ancient incantations, specifically those used to bind or suppress. Not religious hymns, but containment spells. One musicologist, after decoding a section titled Measure 13 ERB, suffered a seizure and was later unable to speak for 6 hours. She described the sound not as heard but as remembered, like something had been placed into her without being spoken. Her report ended with one phrase written over and over. It wants to stay. Investigators realized then that Clorinda hadn't just been assisting Emery. She may have been the architect of the ritual, the voice behind the silence, the one who wrote the score for what silence could become when shaped into a form. Where Emery studied the flesh, Clorinda wrote its language. Each disappearance was not random. It was a measure in her song, a part of a composition growing towards something final, something that still hadn't reached its last note, and even after the hymnal was removed, scanned, and stored, its pages sealed in archival vaults. Strange things continued in Norfield. Choir members reported dreams of humming in the dark, of hands conducting with no body attached. And the piano, untouched since that day, sometimes released a single note after sunset, not loud, not forced, just enough to be heard by anyone walking past. Always the same key, always the same broken harmony. The one that came just before the silence was complete. Elias Finch delivered milk the way most men prayed, quietly, without complaint, and in the early hours before anything could go wrong. He'd lived his whole life in Norfield, long enough to understand the things people didn't say spoke louder than the things they did. He never questioned when doors didn't open or when certain families ordered less milk after a child vanished. Routine was safety, and silence was the currency that kept men like Elias moving forward without cracks. But there was one morning he never forgot, and one memory he never dared place into words until he knew he would not live to see another winter. He waited until his lungs rattled like paper and the skin at his knuckles peeled like old fruit. Only then did he tell someone what he had seen behind the Baldwin house. It was late October, just after first frost, when he arrived at the Baldwin farm earlier than usual. The fog that morning was thick, and his cartwheel had broken a mile outside town, forcing him to walk the last stretch. He rounded the orchard at dawn, and that's when he saw it. Emery Baldwin walking in slow procession through the trees. Not alone. With him were two children, a boy and a girl, both blindfolded, each carrying a glass jar sealed with wax. The jars were small, like canning jars, but heavy-looking, filled with something thick and pinkish. Elias did not call out. He crouched behind a stone wall, heart thudding against his ribs like something trying to get out. Emery walked with a calm rhythm, one hand behind his back, the other gesturing every few steps as if reciting instructions from memory. The children did not speak. Their steps were careful, rehearsed. Each held the jar in front of them as though it were sacred or breakable, or both. Elias squinted through the fog and saw the truth he would carry alone for the next 25 years. Inside each jar was a human tongue, perfectly preserved, suspended in what looked like honey or some kind of sap. They floated like curled slugs, still pink, still intact, as though they had just been removed and placed there to wait. The children did not seem afraid. Their blindfolds were not forced or stained, just wrapped neatly and tied in bows. They moved without resistance, like they trusted him, like they believed what they were doing had purpose. Emery guided them deeper into the orchard to a grove where the trees grew in unnatural symmetry, each planted equidistant, each older than the house itself. Elias could see small holes dug into the soil at the base of several trees. Shallow, just deep enough to bury a jar. He watched as Emery knelt beside one of the holes, received the jars one by one, and placed them inside with a tenderness that made Elias want to scream. Then he covered them with a square of black cloth before filling the holes back in with his bare hands. The children stood silently behind him, their blindfolds still on, their arms lowered, their faces peaceful. When the burial was done, Emery took a small object from his coat, a brush, thin as a reed, and painted something onto the bark of the nearest tree. Elias couldn't see what it was, but the motion was circular, deliberate. A ritual, not a habit. He stayed hidden until they walked back toward the house, the children trailing obediently behind. Then he turned and walked the long way home, never delivering the milk, never returning to that side of the orchard again. He told no one, not his wife, not the sheriff. Because what could he say? That a respected school teacher was burying tongues in glass jars like offerings? That two blindfolded children carried their own voices into the ground and never asked for them back? No one would have believed him. Not then. Maybe not even now. But as Elias Finch lay dying in the back room of the town infirmary, he asked the nurse to fetch the minister. Not for confession, but for record. He made her write it all down, every detail. And at the end of his story, he said something no one expected. He said the trees in that grove had never lost their leaves, not once, not even in the worst of winters. That even in snow their branches stayed full. And that once, in the dead of January, he had walked by on a dare and heard something inside the trunks. Not creaking, not wind, but humming, low and even, like a voice without a mouth, waiting for its sound to be returned. The Baldwin home had long since been picked apart by investigators, historians, and silent men with sharp gloves who left no fingerprint behind. But it wasn't until a junior deputy, young and too new to know which places had already been searched, pried open the underside of a staircase drawer that the most chilling discovery was made. Hidden behind a false back tucked flat in a cedar-lined cavity that smelled faintly of soap and vinegar was a folded bundle of linen. 11 pieces in total, each wrapped in twine, each white as bone and soft as breath. They were not rags, they were burial shrouds. Perfectly tailored, hemmed by hand, and marked with an embroidery style no longer in fashion by 1841. The thread was pale gray, not black, almost invisible unless you looked too long. But once seen, it could not be unseen. Each cloth bore a name, a child's name. Some were familiar: Joseph Baldwin, Margaret Baldwin, Elias, Matthew. Their disappearances had already been whispered into Norfield's history, noted as tragic but unresolved. Others were less expected, names that stirred the memory of families who had quietly moved away, who had never held a funeral, who had clung to the idea their child had simply run. But 3 names brought silence to the entire room, because no one recognized them. There had been no reports, no search parties, no obituaries. These names didn't appear in any record, and yet the shrouds waited for them, already sewn, already named. Children whose absences had not yet happened, or had happened so cleanly the world had failed to notice. None of the shrouds had been used, no stains, no wear. Just gentle folds like they'd been kept warm and undisturbed, waiting for the right time. Each one was stored with something small tucked into its center. A token, a wooden tooth carved from walnut, a dried daisy, petals blackened at the tips, a button from a child's coat wrapped in a circle of red thread. The shrouds weren't mass-made. They were personal. They were meant for someone specific. And they weren't hidden out of guilt. They were hidden the way a craftsman hides his finest work. Not because it is shameful, but because it is sacred. The investigators brought in a fabric expert from Columbus who confirmed what some already feared. The linens had been treated in a mixture not used in common textile practices. A compound of alum, salt, and ash. The same solution used historically in the preparation of sacred burial cloths for ritual interment. Not just to cover the dead, but to bind them spiritually. Each cloth had been dipped and dried, then embroidered with careful tension. The thread piercing the fabric with such consistency it suggested a guiding frame or wheel, as if the maker wasn't sewing by hand but following something fixed and absolute. One of the officers, a man with a young daughter of his own, excused himself after handling the final shroud. He claimed he felt a pulse, not in the cloth but in his fingertips. He said it felt like holding something that had once belonged to someone else's breath, not memory but expectancy. Like the fabric knew it was supposed to be used, knew its purpose had been delayed, not denied. And still it waited. Clorinda Baldwin's needle was later found inside a hollowed drawer of her vanity. It had no rust, no wear. The eye of the needle still held a length of pale thread, looped but not knotted, as if she had been called away mid-stitch. It lay beside a tiny silver bell, the kind once tied to the fingers of the dead to alert the living in case of premature burial. But this bell had no clapper, no sound. It had been sealed shut with wax. No one could say why, only that it had been placed beside the shroud's final tool, not by accident, but with intention. The names were transcribed, entered into record, and cross-referenced with every birth registry in the region. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a neighboring county. A child had gone missing. A girl named Ruth, whose name had been sewn, misspelled slightly, into one of the Baldwin shrouds. She had vanished before anyone reported her. Before the parents understood she wasn't coming home. That made 11. 11 names, 11 cloths, 11 waiting deaths. And if the Baldwin house taught Norfield anything, it was that silence does not wait idly. It prepares, it stitches, it names what others are too afraid to say aloud. And sometimes it finishes the work long before anyone realizes it's begun. It was a coincidence that uncovered it, if such a thing still existed in Norfield. The old Baldwin piano, long since unplayed, had been marked for removal by a preservation team cataloging furniture from the house. When they attempted to lift the bench, a leg buckled. A worker, reaching to steady it, noticed something shift inside. Not a tool or a paper or even a forgotten note, but something that gave a sound too soft to be wood and too deliberate to be debris. Beneath the lining of the bench's seat, tucked between the cushion and the baseboard, was a book no larger than a palm. Leather-bound, stitched tight with faded thread and torn clean through the middle, as if someone had ripped it away from its own ending. The pages were brittle, water-damaged at the edges, but the ink had not faded. The writing was unmistakably Clorinda Baldwin's. Her script was tight, slanted, meticulous, the handwriting of a woman who practiced each word before committing it to the page. At first, the journal read like a hymn book. Short phrases, repetitions, quiet notes on posture, breath control, and temperature. But as the pages turned, it became clear this was not a musical diary. It was a record. Not of grief or guilt, but of process. A documentation of something she called the mouthless ritual. She wrote of silence as a kind of salvation, a state not of absence but of refinement. Where most feared the stillness between words, Clorinda saw it as purity. She believed sound corrupted the soul, that it fractured memory, scattered thought, and allowed decay to take root in the mind. Noise, she wrote, was the beginning of death. But silence, full, controlled, willing silence, was a form of preservation. Each stitch across a child's lips was not an act of cruelty but a seal. Not murder, but containment. She called it rescuing from sound. She wrote of the body as a vessel and the voice as its most dangerous organ. Emery had taught her anatomy. She had taught him restraint. Together they had developed a system to preserve what she called the final moment. The instant just before a child spoke in pain, in confusion, in fear. That moment, she believed, was where the soul was clearest, where memory was whole. If the voice could be stopped before it broke that clarity, the self could be preserved in a perfect state, not living, not dead, but unblurred. Clorinda made no mention of God, no appeal to heaven or penance. Her beliefs were not tied to religion. They were stitched together from something older, something stranger. She referenced books no one recognized. The silence of rooted flesh, the throat's geometry, chambers of pre-voice. She described rituals involving salt and heat, the sealing of the hyoid bone with resin, the drying of the tongue with ash from quiet branches. These were not the ramblings of a madwoman. They were the notes of someone deeply practiced in their craft, someone who believed they were acting on truth, not theory. Near the torn end of the journal, there was one passage different from the rest. It had been written shakily, as if her hand had begun to fail her, or her certainty had begun to fray. She described a moment, one she had never intended to record. She spoke of a child who would not still, a boy who hummed under the cloth even as his mouth was stitched, who bled in patterns she couldn't control. She wrote that he whispered after his throat was sealed, that he spoke without air. She had buried him behind the chimney, alone, unfinished. She wrote that sometimes she could hear him in her sleep, but not with her ears. He said only one thing: "You took it from me, and it's still alive." She ended the journal not with a confession, but with an equation. A drawn circle, a broken line, and 3 words etched in reverse: hold, do not echo. And below it, a second hand had scrawled something else much newer. Possibly Emery's, possibly someone who found the journal before the police. The new ink was darker, fresher. It said, "She stitched so well, I still hear nothing." The bench was sealed again, the journal locked away. But the house felt different afterward. Colder, as if her final entry had finished something the others had only built toward. And from the moment that journal was opened, the piano, untouched for decades, refused to stay closed. The lid lifted in the night, not violently, just enough for air to move through the strings and hum a note no one could trace, a sound shaped like silence, carried by something still waiting to be heard. Samuel Baldwin was never spoken of in Norfield after the house was emptied. He was the quietest of the children, the one who blended behind his siblings. A shadow in photographs and a name barely whispered at roll call. While others vanished or were buried beneath silence, Samuel slipped away under another name. He surfaced years later in Illinois, not as a farmer's son or teacher's child, but as a hospital orderly, the kind of man who mopped floors at night and carried bedpans in the morning. He was trusted because he was plain, because he asked for nothing, because he smiled when spoken to but never lingered in conversation. For decades, he remained invisible. He worked in surgical wings, morgues, and basements, always volunteering for the late shift, always requesting the tasks no one else wanted. His supervisors called him reliable. Patients called him kind. But when the hospital began renovations in the 1890s, a locked storeroom in the basement was broken open. Inside were rows of wooden crates stacked like coffins, each containing the same site discovered in Norfield years earlier. Preserved bodies with mouths sewn shut, eyes painted wide, and organs carefully removed, arranged, and catalogued as though for study. On the shelves beside them were jars, each labeled not with medical terms but with dates and initials. The handwriting matched the Baldwin cipher. The staff who uncovered it resigned in silence. Records were destroyed. Official reports never surfaced, but whispers spread among orderlies that the crates were not moved or buried. They were quietly transferred, sent elsewhere by rail. And Samuel, whose real name had long been erased, simply left his post and was never seen again. His work did not end in Norfield. It did not end in Illinois. It lived on in each sealed mouth, each preserved silence, each vessel prepared to wait forever. Because the Baldwin method was never meant for one family or one town. It was meant to continue unseen, wherever silence could be mistaken for peace. In the years after the Baldwin case fell into silence, Norfield tried to reshape itself into something ordinary. The orchard was cut down, the house abandoned, the cellar sealed beneath heavy stone. But memory has a way of bleeding through even the strongest barriers. A decade later, a memorial appeared in the town square. 11 stones laid in a half circle, each carved with the name of a child who had never been given a grave. No family claimed responsibility. No church announced it. The money for the stones came through anonymous donations sent in brown envelopes never traced. And still, every Sunday, someone placed fresh flowers there. When county records unsealed a year later, darker truths surfaced. Court evidence revealed burial rights had been denied to the Baldwin children and to others whose names were found stitched into hidden shrouds. Legal loopholes left their remains in storage, unburied, unblessed. It was as though the silence that marked their deaths had extended even into the law. Only then did the state intervene, passing new statutes outlawing ritual preservation. The language was clinical, but everyone knew what it meant. It was the Baldwin law. Ohio, by decree, would never again allow a body to be treated as text, as canvas, as vessel. Yet none of that erased the fact that for years people had lived beside the Baldwin house, seen its curtains, heard its piano, and said nothing. The Baldwin legacy is not remembered in photographs or sermons, but in the way silence still lingers over Norfield. No one dares speak their name aloud in the town that raised them. The house is gone, but the quiet remains. Because evil, when paired with method, does not scream. It writes, it studies, it waits. The most frightening minds do not revel in chaos. They believe in order. They believe they're saving the world. What do you think? Could this happen again? Would we even recognize it?